What if I told you that the United States government once made it a crime for you to own gold? Not just to trade it, not just to hoard massive amounts of it, but simply to possess it in your own home. I'm not talking about some distant dictatorship or failed state. I'm talking about America in 1933, when ordinary citizens were forced to make an impossible choice: hand over your gold or face 10 years in prison and a fine of $10,000. That's the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today, all for the crime of holding on to something humans have valued for thousands of years. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the money you trusted, the treasure you saved, the gold coins your grandfather passed down to you, were suddenly illegal. You had weeks to turn them in. After that, you'd be a criminal. This wasn't some elaborate scam run by con artists. This was written into law by the highest office in the land. And what happened next changed the course of the financial system forever. I need you to understand something before we go any further. What I'm about to tell you isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented history. And the reason it matters today is simple. If they did it once, they can do it again. The only difference is what form it takes next time. Let me take you back to one of the darkest chapters in American economic history. By 1933, the United States was broken. The Great Depression had torn through the country like a wildfire. 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Factories that once roared with production sat silent and empty. Banks were collapsing by the thousands, taking people's life savings with them. Families who had worked hard for decades were losing everything overnight. But the real crisis was invisible to most people. The banking system itself was collapsing from the inside. And the reason was gold. You see, back then, the dollar was backed by gold, under what they called the classical gold standard. Every paper dollar you held was supposed to be backed by a fixed amount of real physical gold sitting in a vault somewhere. The government promised that you could exchange your $20 bill for almost 1 ounce of gold, valued at exactly $20.67 per ounce. That was the deal. That was what gave people confidence in paper money. But when the Depression hit and banks started failing, that confidence cracked. People panicked. They rushed to banks and demanded their gold, not paper dollars, real gold. And why wouldn't they? If the system was falling apart, you wanted something solid, something real, something that had held value for thousands of years. The problem was simple mathematics. There wasn't enough gold to go around. Banks had loaned out money they didn't fully have. The whole system was built on trust. And when trust evaporated, the banks were exposed. Gold was draining out of the vaults at an alarming rate, and the entire financial system was on the verge of total collapse. That's when Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the picture. He was sworn in as president in March 1933, walking into an economy in free fall. Unemployment was skyrocketing. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. The banking system was hours away from complete destruction. He needed something bold, something radical, something that would stop the panic dead in its tracks. Less than a month later, he found his solution. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. With the stroke of a pen, he made it illegal for private American citizens to own most forms of gold. Let that sink in for a moment. Overnight, gold ownership became a crime. The order gave people until the end of April to surrender their gold. You had to bring your coins, your bars, your gold certificates to the Federal Reserve or a member bank. In return, they would pay you in paper dollars at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce. You had no choice, no negotiation, no alternative. The government said this was necessary to stabilize the banking system, to prevent hoarding, and to give the Federal Reserve the ability to expand the money supply. They dressed it up in the language of national emergency and patriotic duty. But strip away the rhetoric, and what you're left with is one of the largest forced transfers of wealth in modern history. Americans lined up to hand over their gold, their coins, their bars, even family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations. Some people tried to resist. They hid gold in their basements, buried it in fields, melted it down into jewelry to avoid detection. But most people complied because the penalties were too severe to risk. 10 years in prison, financial ruin. The threat was real, and people believed the government would enforce it. Now here's the part that should make your blood boil. After collecting all that gold from American citizens, the government didn't just lock it away and forget about it. Less than a year later, in January 1934, they passed the Gold Reserve Act. And with that act, they officially revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. Let me spell that out for you. The government forced citizens to hand over their gold at about $20 an ounce. Then, almost immediately, they declared that same gold was now worth $35 an ounce. That's a 40% devaluation of the dollar overnight. The people handed over their wealth at the old price. The government pocketed the instant profit, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. This wasn't some minor policy adjustment. This was a deliberate reset of the entire monetary system. By seizing gold and devaluing the dollar, the Roosevelt administration gave itself the power to inflate the money supply far beyond what the gold standard had previously allowed. It let them spend more, borrow more, and launch the massive New Deal programs that would define the era. For the banks, it was salvation. The gold now sitting in Federal Reserve vaults restored confidence in the financial system. For the government, it was control. Total control over the money supply and the economy. But for ordinary Americans, it was theft, plain and simple. Theft dressed up as law. I want you to imagine this on a personal level. Picture your grandparents. They worked their entire lives. They saved gold coins because gold was real. It was safe. It was wealth you could hold in your hand. Then one day, the government declares those coins illegal. They force your grandparents to hand them over at a fixed price. And then, almost immediately, the government turns around and says that gold is worth 40% more than what they just paid. Your family loses, the government gains, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. That's not a hypothetical scenario. That's exactly what happened to millions of American families in 1933. Even back then, people knew this was wrong. Lawsuits flooded the courts. The cases eventually reached the Supreme Court in what became known as the Gold Clause cases. You see, many contracts at that time were written with what they called gold clauses. These were promises to repay debts not in paper currency, but in actual gold. It was a hedge against inflation, a way to protect yourself from the government printing too much money. By seizing gold and devaluing the dollar, the government had effectively voided all of those contracts. Creditors sued, arguing that the government was trampling on private agreements and confiscating property without proper compensation. The cases were serious. The stakes were enormous. In 1935, the Supreme Court made its ruling. By a single vote, they upheld Roosevelt's actions. One vote. That's how close we came to a different outcome. That ruling set a chilling precedent that echoes to this day. In times of crisis, the government can rewrite the rules of money, override private contracts, and seize wealth in the name of national interest. But here's the deeper truth that most people miss. This wasn't just about saving banks from collapse. This was about breaking the gold standard itself. For centuries, gold had been the ultimate check on government power. If the government printed too much money, people could demand gold instead. That kept the system honest. It put limits on how much governments could manipulate the currency. By taking control of all the gold and removing it from private hands, Roosevelt severed the most direct link between citizens and hard money. Paper dollars became the only legal currency, backed not by the promise of gold redemption, but by government decree, by force, by law. The financial system had entered a new era, an era where trust in gold was replaced by forced trust in authority. So who really won in this massive wealth transfer? The government, obviously. By seizing gold and then revaluing it, Washington instantly boosted the value of its reserves by billions of dollars. This wasn't pocket change. It gave Roosevelt the financial firepower to launch ambitious New Deal programs, to expand public spending on an unprecedented scale, and to stabilize the banking system without having to raise taxes dramatically in the middle of a depression. From a pure power perspective, it was brilliant. It was financial engineering at its finest. But it was also a direct assault on the principle of private property. The banks were the next big winners. By transferring citizens' gold into the vaults of the Federal Reserve, The government guaranteed the stability of the entire banking sector. Confidence, which had been shattered by endless bank runs, could finally be restored. The public was told this was all necessary to save the economy. But it's hard to ignore the reality. The very institutions that had failed ordinary depositors were being bailed out at the expense of the people who had trusted them. And then there were the wealthy and politically connected. They always seem to find a way, don't they? Some of them managed to shift their gold overseas before the order took effect. Others converted their wealth into assets that were exempt from confiscation, like certain collectible coins or jewelry. They had lawyers, they had connections, they had options. Ordinary citizens had none of that. They complied, or they risked prison. The result was exactly what you'd expect: a transfer of wealth upward, away from regular households and into the hands of the state and the elite. Now let's talk about the losers. That part is painfully obvious. Millions of Americans who had saved in gold, who believed they were holding something tangible and safe, discovered that their safety net could vanish overnight. Their gold was taken. They were given paper dollars in exchange. And then those dollars immediately lost value when the government devalued the currency. The people who trusted the system the most lost the most. And what they learned, in the hardest way possible, was that the rules of money are not fixed. They're not natural laws. They can be rewritten in an instant, with the stroke of a pen, when it serves the interests of power. Now let me bring this forward to today. You might be thinking, okay, that's a fascinating history lesson, but why should I care about something that happened 90 years ago? Here's why: because the principle hasn't changed. When the system is threatened, governments will do whatever it takes to preserve it, even if that means stripping citizens of their wealth. The tactics might look different, but the underlying dynamic is exactly the same. In 1933, it was gold confiscation. In 2008, it was trillions of dollars in taxpayer-funded bailouts for banks that were deemed too big to fail. You paid for that, I paid for that, we all did. In 2013, Cyprus imposed what they called bail-ins, directly seizing a portion of citizens' bank deposits to stabilize the financial system. People woke up one morning to find their bank accounts had been raided by their own government. In 2020, we saw unprecedented money printing during the pandemic. Asset prices inflated wildly while wages struggled to keep up. If you owned stocks or real estate, you got richer. If you lived on a salary, your purchasing power eroded. That's wealth transfer in action, hidden behind emergency policies and stimulus packages. And inflation itself? Inflation is confiscation. You may not see armed agents knocking on your door today, but every year that prices rise faster than your wages, the same effect is achieved. Your savings buy less, your labor is worth less, and the system absorbs the difference. It's wealth transfer in slow motion, hidden in plain sight. That's the modern version of confiscation, not through brute force, but through monetary policy. The lesson from 1933 is absolutely clear. Don't assume your wealth is untouchable. Don't assume the system will play by its own rules when the pressure's on. When crisis hits, the rules will change. They always do. If the government once made gold illegal to own, what would stop them from freezing digital bank accounts during the next crisis? What would stop them from seizing retirement accounts or pensions? What would stop them from imposing wealth taxes that strip savings from ordinary people? The precedent has already been set. The only difference is the form it takes next time. This is why real wealth cannot be measured only in digits on a screen. True financial freedom requires assets and knowledge that stand outside the reach of sudden policy shifts. It requires skills that no government can confiscate. It means holding hard assets that retain value even when paper promises collapse. And it demands awareness of history, so that when the next emergency is declared, you recognize the patterns instead of being blindsided. When America stole its citizens' gold in 1933, it wasn't pitched as theft. It was framed as rescue, as patriotism, as necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The propaganda was powerful, the rhetoric was compelling, but the outcome was undeniable. The system survived, and the people paid the price. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it whispers the same warnings across generations. If they could take wealth once, they can take it again. The methods might evolve, but the principle remains constant. And if you don't understand how money and power really operate, you'll always be the one left holding worthless paper when the rules change. So the next time you hear a politician promise economic stability or a banker assure you that your money is perfectly safe, I want you to remember 1933. Remember that the rules of the financial system are not laws of nature. They're decisions made by people in power. And decisions made by power can turn against you in an instant, especially when those in power decide their survival is more important than your property rights. Protect yourself, not with blind faith in institutions, but with knowledge, awareness, and the relentless pursuit of real wealth. Understand the game being played. Recognize the patterns of history. And never, ever assume that what happened before can't happen again, because it can. And when it does, the only question that will matter is this: will you see it coming, or will you be caught completely by surprise? The choice is yours, but the warning has been given. If this opened your eyes to something you'd never considered before, make sure you subscribe. History holds the answers to our future, and I'll keep showing you exactly where to look.